Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Today I'm welcoming back Dr. Rick Staggenborg. Rick is a retired Veterans Administration psychiatrist and a post-Vietnam Army veteran who is specialized in post-traumatic stress disorder in his practice. He's a trained psychotherapist with a particular interest in how perception is modified to manufacture consent for war. Rick is also chapter president of the Linus chapter of Veterans for Peace in Corvallis, Oregon, and is currently active in the campaign for public banking. Just to kick it off, one of the things that's really been a problem with this COVID pandemic and the resulting lockdown has been that businesses are not making the money, they're not paying the taxes, and so state and local governments are running out of funds. And the government at least hasn't been, up to this point, willing to help them out. Is there another way this can be, that states can get revenue without taxing people?
Absolutely. It's the ideal way to do it would be, well, there's a couple of things. You could have a national bank that's owned by the federal government and has the power to create its own money instead of delegating that to the Federal Reserve, which is owned by the 11 major branch banks, which are private. And of course, they're looking out for their interests, not just ours, if they're looking out for ours at all.
Yeah.
So that would be the ideal thing. And the next best thing would have a national infrastructure bank. That's actually being worked on, so that we could use the credit of the federal government to just create money out of nowhere instead of leaving that to private interest that can be paid back with interest.
Yeah. What's the difference now between what you're talking about, a national bank or a national infrastructure bank, and the Federal Reserve? Other than, who manages it, but how would they operate differently?
Well, the Federal Reserve can't actually distribute money directly. It's not really a bank. The Treasury has that authority, but they don't generally do that unless they're ordered. Well, they don't do it at all unless they're ordered to by Congress. Yeah. What we've seen is Congress does not want to cough up the money to bail out the states during this crisis, which is one of probably the only thing I can think is that would justify deficit spending. We do it all the time anyway, but we do it to support the military. We should be doing it now to support the people. And they're doing this in other countries. Whether they have public banks or not, the government is ponying up money, make sure people have enough to live on, stay in their homes, have access. They already have access to health care, have other basic necessities. In the United States, we don't do that. Think about it. You mentioned that tax revenues are down as jobs are being lost. But this is at the same time that demand is going up for state funds for Medicaid, for rolling out COVID. That's not all paid for by the federal government. There's just a lot of extra expenses, housing assistance, food assistance, whatever a state chooses to do. Meanwhile, they've got to pay all their regular obligations. Yeah. So they really need that money. That's all there is to it. And if they're not going to get it from the federal government, the best way to do it would be a state public bank.
Let me back up a couple of things. Back to the federal for a second. Fed actually, since the 2008 crisis, has been engaged in what they call quantitative easing. So, in other words, they're basically printing money and more or less handing it to the big banks. The big banks are buying their stock back, otherwise not investing that money. And now they've even started, taking bad corporate debt on and getting reimbursing corporations for that. So they are sort of, as you had suggested earlier, they're printing money and giving it away, but they're giving it away to people that don't need it instead of giving it away to people that do need it.
That's right.
Right. And then before we talk about state banks, I mean, I think a lot of people have a misunderstanding about how banks operate in the first place. I mean, I think most people, we learned in school, the bank takes in your deposits for your savings accounts and they sit there in the vault and then they loan that money out to people that need loans and mortgages and, small business loans or whatever. That leaves a lot out.
The actual system is called fractional reserve lending.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that banks keep a certain amount of reserves on hand, and then they can lend based on that. They can lend a multiple of what they actually have. Mm-hmm. And banks have leveraged that to the hilt and used it to buy derivatives. They did that in the past. They're actually still doing it. Mm-hmm. That money's going somewhere, and it isn't going into building up businesses or creating jobs. It's going largely into derivatives, according to Ellen Brown.
First of all, where does the state bank get its money?
It depends on the state. Mm-hmm. In Oregon, where we live, it's actually unconstitutional to have a state bank. So it would take a constitutional amendment to be able to create a state bank in Oregon. But I was told that there was a bill introduced into this legislative session that would change the Constitution to allow for the creation of a state public bank.
Yeah. Right now, only one state has a public bank, right?
That's right, North Dakota.
Okay. And so
fabulously successful.
So where does that North Dakota bank get its money?
There are different ways you could do it. They could use reserve funds that are just sitting in accounts. That's one way to do it. That you could use private investors actually to create the reserves necessary. Or theoretically, they could use their own credit, just the credit of the state of North Dakota. And they have used that, I know. But what combination they used to start it, I really can't say.
Yeah, no. Well, one of the things that comes to mind is the idea that states are all already using banks. When the tax revenue comes in, as it does every week or month or whatever, whenever it comes in, the state deposits that money in some bank somewhere, and that money stays there until it's spent in the form of payroll or projects the state wants to undertake. So if the state and assumably municipalities within the state deposited their money in a state bank, over the course of the year, that money's going to come back out. But then the bank would be able to loan out far more than the money it had using the fractional reserve system. And they could invest in things that would help people and help the state grow, right?
That's right. One of the advantages of a public bank is that whatever level of government is doing it gets to set the priorities for how the money's loaned out. So if you want to help minority businesses, you can target them for loans. If you want to help certain types of business, if you have a national bank, say, and you want to help certain industries, you could do that. Japan does that with their national bank.
Yeah.
China does that with their development bank. We did that with an infrastructure bank that we had during the Great Depression. And so they funded all kinds of great projects. And like you said, the money comes back. I mean, they may create the money out of thin air, but it comes back. And it comes back with interest, just like a private bank. But it isn't the kind of onerous interest rates that make it impossible for a lot of businesses to benefit from them.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of things that need to be done in this country that aren't really getting funded by private individuals and private companies. I mean, things like green energy, for example. Conversion over to electric cars or mass transit or housing for the poor. I mean, there are any number of things that you could talk about that just don't get done because there's no money to be made doing them.
Well, and because of this notion that has been promoted in Washington, that you have to have a balanced budget. I mean, they even tried to pass a constitutional amendment. That's a crazy idea.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the main reasons to have a public bank is so that you can put money in the economy when it's not doing so well. And that's not when private banks invest.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. It's called counter-cyclical lending. And
Sure.
You aren't going to find any private bank doing that, but that's how you get yourself out of a depression.
Mm-hmm.
And we're pretty close to that now. COVID has really got us on the edge. And things aren't going to bounce right back. There are, I don't know, probably millions, I would say, but let's just say tens of thousands, more likely hundreds of thousands at minimum of businesses, small businesses, are shutting down forever. I mean, the restaurant industry, traditionally, a lot of businesses fail in the restaurant industry. Well, this is something that very few restaurants can make it through if they're following the lockdown rules. And it's far from over. I mean, I don't know when things are going to open up to the point where people can just walk into a restaurant and feel safe. We're not going to have herd immunity before next fall at the very earliest.
Oh, yeah. Even if Biden is able to get his 100 million vaccinations done in the next 100 days, so that still leaves a lot of people that don't have them.
Yeah, I think you need 70% or 80%, something like that.
Well, people want to find out more about public banking. There are websites or groups that they can, go to.
Sure, I recommend the Public Banking Institute.
Mm-hmm.
They are particularly working on the National Infrastructure Bank project right now, but they also have plenty of information about state banks and municipal banks, which we didn't really get into. In Oregon, there's the Oregon Public Bank Alliance, and I'm with that alliance, and we are working for municipal banks at the city level, where groups of cities can get together and use their reserves, probably. In that case, that's how it would work. Use their reserves to fund a bank so that they can make infrastructure loans to participating communities.
Right, and that would be legal under the Oregon Constitution, I take it.
Yes, there's been a determination by the Attorney General, I believe the Attorney General. At any rate, there's been an official determination that that would be legal.
You're listening to Wider View, a weekly conversation with analysts and activists rarely found in the mainstream media. Wider View is made available free of charge to radio stations nationwide, and a podcast of this show is available on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Play Music as Wider View Radio, and at widerviewradio.podbean.com. You can also follow us on Facebook at Wider View Radio. So I want to sort of change the topic here a little bit because, one of the reasons that we need to invest in the country, it seems to me, is that when people have no hope and feel that they've been abandoned by their government, aren't able to give their children the kind of financial well-being that they once had, they tend to look for some kind of a solution. And we saw several thousand of them storm the U.S. Capitol on the January the 6th. What's your reaction right now to what transpired on the 6th?
I guess I'd have to say I'm not terribly surprised. People were predicting violence for a long time. Before that, it was obvious that Trump was getting people on the fringes of reality, you could say, to get all worked up about things that were mostly imaginary. On the other hand, there were some real reasons for them to be riled up too. It's pretty clear that certain individuals and institutions had an interest in trying to undermine the Trump administration right from the beginning. And in particular, because he wanted to reset relations with Russia. And the neoconservative project right now is to demonize Russia, surround it with missiles, and undercut it every way it can, economically, politically, and if necessary, militarily. Trump was a target, and the fact that progressives never acknowledged that or even realize it, I don't think they're pretending that he didn't. I think they really don't know, because the corporate media has carried this ridiculous Russiagate story.
It still is carrying it. Yeah.
I was just going to say, most things disappear after 24 hours, but when they want to get a message across, they'll hit it every damn day for months if that's what it takes.
Yeah, and I frankly was reading the New York Times this morning. Here was a long article about the transition between Obama and Trump, and what took place around that transition 4 years ago. And of course, every few paragraphs, we mentioned the Russian interference, and they even talked about the P tapes and all that. They just will not let that go. Yeah, there was a definite attempt, I think, by liberals to keep Trump from doing anything, or at least certain things that they didn't want him to do, undermine him in any way they could. As a problem here that we have to differentiate between what I will call, for lack of a better term, liberals, people who are, Democratic Party stalwarts who listen to MSNBC and CNN and who believe what their government tells them and, what they hear on the media, and follow along with whether it's Russiagate or Ukraine gate, or now they have to be angry at China. Maduro of Venezuela is a dictator, and Juan Guaido is a fighter for democracy. I mean, any kind of ludicrous nonsense they can come up with. But, they're people that believe all that stuff. But I don't see those people as being part of the left. What I would call the left is people who are much more aware of what's going on and understand that all this is being done for a tiny oligarchy of very wealthy people at the top. This is all not what it seems to be. That's as much a conspiracy theory as QAnon, perhaps. I don't know.
Well, it may sound like it, but the difference is that this is pretty well documented.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can go all the way back to Professor Harold Quigley and his book back, I think it came out in 1968, Tragedy and Hope. He was part of that small group of people. He was intimate with them and close to them and studied them. And in fact, I'm just reading right now a little synopsis of Tragedy and Hope. It's called Tragedy and Hope 101. And it just summarizes the key things that are interspersed in that 1,300-page tome. And so anyway, he claims that the elite actually wanted him to document the story. They just didn't want him to publish it.
Right.
And then they were okay with him being part of this because they thought he was very supportive of their ultimate aims. Apparently he didn't have a problem with that, but he did have some problems with some of the things they did. But this basic system, apparently not. So it's pretty shocking that a person would lay this out thinking that, it's just going to be an interesting discussion or something. If people knew the details of how the power really works in this world, they would be probably most of them would be pretty freaked out.
As I say, there's a close relationship between the left and what generally is referred to as the far right, which is that idea that the government is not really working for us. They're working, for the parties in the back. So this is why, for example, we always have to increase military spending. We can never decrease military spending. We can never withdraw from a country that we've invaded, even when we lose the war. And also, we never really get to a point of really helping ordinary people unless we have a crash like happened in 29, and we got a person like Roosevelt who came in and saved capitalism. He saved capitalism by providing things like Social Security and so forth. So he gave the people enough that they didn't revolt. But what I'm sensing now in the country is that neither party is willing to give people what they want. They're ruled by these neoliberal ideology and these, America has to be running the world, and they're not going to deal with those things. And
Well,
I think,
that's right. And the basis of it is really pretty simple. If you think about it for a second, we have a privately funded system of federal elections
Mhm.
and also state elections too. So all the way down to local elections for that matter. Anyway, what do you expect to get when you have privately funded system of elections? The people that pay for the elections are the ones that are going to be listened to first. So the Princeton study that came out a few years ago, demonstrating that there's zero correlation between what the people want, the people who actually have the vast majority of the votes, no correlation between what they want and what the Congress comes up with. There is, on the other hand, a very strong correlation between what the wealthiest 1% want, or 5%, I don't remember what benchmark they used, but what the wealthiest people in the country want and what Congress does.
Yeah.
So there's really no gridlock in Congress when it comes to the corporate interest. If something serves the corporate interest, it gets passed. If it challenges the corporate interest, it does not. That's the only reason that we don't have universal health care, because it would actually save money. So all this blathering about balancing the budget and having to be fiscally responsible, it's about making profits for the health insurance industry, I should say the medical insurance industry, corporate providers, and pharmacy companies. That's all it's about. It's the only reason that they haven't done it already.
Oh, yeah. No.
And the fact that the media goes along with the corporate bottom line, too.
Well, of course, the media is owned by big corporations now.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
all five of those mega corporations.
yeah, that's right. Yeah, there's not many, and then now even the even local newspapers are being bought up by huge conglomerates. Yeah, we've come to a situation though where it looks like people are beginning to revolt. Now, in my opinion, they're revolting for all the wrong reasons, and they're attacking at least some of the wrong people. But I understand the frustration. I understand the frustration that they have. And I think it's shared by a number of people on the left as well. But maybe we're not as likely to put on horns and go, go in the Capitol and screaming and yelling.
Well, part of the reason is that the American public's been trained to be frightened of communism and socialism, and a lot of the solutions to our problems are, frankly, socialistic, if not socialist, and so they automatically reject those. So the idea that we can work with them is kind of fantastical, although it's not really impossible. There was a time when American workers, farmers, did get together, educated each other through alternative means, not through the mainstream newspapers, and educated each other about what the real problems were. And they called for nationalization of essential industries like the railroads. They called for public banks. They called for a system where the government actually created the money, which is inherent in the National Public Bank, and then and that they use it for purposes of helping average people. They were the populists. They actually they elected a senator, Bob Follett from Wisconsin. That's about as far as they got. They ended up losing their power after backing Williams Jennings Bryan twice. He got them to compromise. Instead of calling for a greenback dollar that would be backed only by the full faith of the United States, he wanted to expand the money supply by allowing silver to be used as a currency too, the bimetal system. So they figured that's better than nothing, because the most important thing was to expand the money supply so average people could get some of it. And but he lost, so they made a compromise. They lost anyway, and the thing lost steam after going through a couple of election cycles. That was in response to the abuses that they suffered after the corporations basically took power of the Congress after the Reconstruction. It was a reaction to that, but they educated themselves so they knew who the enemy was. They weren't fighting each other. The farmers and the workers in the cities were working together. You can't do that now. They've very systematically divided us up. Rural areas are predominantly red, and cities are, a lot of cities are predominantly blue. There's an urban-rural divide all over the country.
Sure.
And that's one of the ways they divide us. They divide us in lots of ways. The most important thing beyond that is that they control the media. As you said, they control the message. So people tend not to have enough basic knowledge of these things to figure it out for themselves, so they depend on the media. They don't know where to get the real information. You and I are called conspiracy theorists because of the things we talk about. But all we're really doing is talking about things that people used to know.
Yeah, sure.
In the 90s, people understood this stuff better than now. We've forgotten it. We've been systematically brainwashed, literally washed. They've washed away our memory of these things, collective memory. And so that's why people like you and I are out trying to educate people about this stuff.
Right.
If people understood this, they would be with us on a lot of these issues.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's beginning to be a populist movement. I mean, Trump was, unfortunately for them, the person they rallied behind. But what I'm concerned about too at this point is, how do we bring the country together, or can we bring the country together after we have spent, 40 years polarizing the nation, so that now we have completely different media that people listen to and watch, completely different sets of facts. The right doesn't have the same facts that we have. They have different facts. I don't see how you come to a point where we can have a successful democratic government in the country.
Well, it's going to take a change in political consciousness and personal consciousness. We're going to have to realize that people who think differently than we do are humans too. They've just been programmed differently.
Well, we've run out of time, and I want to thank Rick Staggenborg for coming on the program again to share his insights. I'd love to hear yours as well. Send me an email at widerviewradio@gmail.com or post on our Facebook page, Wider View Radio. As always, the views expressed on Wider View are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. We aim to provoke you to think outside the box and question the narratives you hear from the mainstream media and our national leaders. I hope we have succeeded. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thanks for listening to Wider View.